If someone you loved asked you to disappear with them for 3 weeks and refused to tell you why, would you go? I have replayed that question in my head more times than I can count, and every single time I arrive at the same answer. Yes, I would still say yes. Even knowing how everything would end, I would climb into that old SUV all over again. I would watch the Chicago skyline disappear in the rearview mirror without asking a single extra question, because some journeys are not meant to be understood before they begin. They are only meant to be lived. 3 weeks earlier, my life was wonderfully ordinary. I spent my weekdays editing landscape photographs inside my tiny apartment on the north side of the city, chasing deadlines for travel magazines that rarely remembered my name after publication. My camera was the only thing I truly trusted. Landscapes never lied. Mountains never pretended to be something they were not. People were much harder to read. Especially Ryan Carter. Ryan had been my best friend since we were 18 years old. We met during freshman orientation after he confidently insisted he knew exactly where the student center was and somehow led both of us to the engineering building instead. We laughed about that mistake for years. Somewhere between late-night study sessions, cheap pizza, impossible exams, broken relationships, and first apartments with paper-thin walls, he quietly became the most important person in my life. There was only one problem. Ryan always called himself straight, and I never gave him a reason to question that. Loving him became the kind of secret that slowly settled into my bones until it felt less like heartbreak and more like gravity. It was always there, quietly pulling at me, impossible to escape, but easy enough to ignore if I kept moving. Then my phone rang on an ordinary Tuesday evening while rain tapped softly against my apartment window. His name lit up my screen, and I answered without thinking. "Hey," I said. "You busy this weekend?" he asked. "Depends. Are you helping me move another couch?" He laughed, but something about it sounded different, almost distant. "No, I need to ask you something." I leaned back in my chair, watching headlights blur through the rain outside. "Go ahead." He hesitated longer than Ryan ever hesitated. "Come drive across America with me." I waited for the punchline. It never came. "For vacation?" I finally asked. "Just come with me." "Ryan, that is almost 3,000 miles. "I know. Why now?" Silence. I could hear traffic somewhere on his end of the call before he finally spoke again. "Because I do not want to wait anymore." The sentence sounded simple, but something inside it felt impossibly heavy. Ryan was the most organized person I had ever met. He planned everything weeks in advance, compared hotel reviews like they were legal documents, and refused to buy concert tickets until he had researched parking options. Spontaneous decisions were not part of who he was. "How long?" I asked. "About 3 weeks." "That is a long time." "I know." Another pause settled between us. Then his voice became almost painfully quiet. "Please, Ethan." He had never asked me for anything like that before. Not once in 8 years of friendship. Whatever this trip meant to him, it mattered enough to make him say the one word he almost never used. I looked around my apartment at camera equipment, unfinished edits, unpaid invoices, and a calendar that suddenly seemed far less important than the silence on the other end of the phone. Something deep inside me whispered that this conversation would divide my life into before and after. I had no evidence, no explanation, just an instinct I could not ignore. I closed my eyes and smiled despite the strange feeling growing in my chest. "Pick me up Saturday morning," I said. I had absolutely no idea that the road waiting beyond my front door was about to reveal the greatest truth either of us had ever tried to hide. Saturday arrived with clear skies and the kind of crisp September air that always made Chicago feel like it was quietly preparing for something new. At exactly 8 o'clock, Ryan pulled into the parking lot outside my apartment in the same dark green SUV he had driven since college. The paint had faded a little over the years, and the front bumper carried a few scratches from adventures neither of us could remember clearly anymore, but somehow it still looked ready to cross the country. He climbed out wearing a navy flannel shirt over a gray t-shirt, hiking boots, and a worn baseball cap. His smile appeared the moment he saw me, warm and familiar enough to make me wonder if I had imagined the strange hesitation during our phone call. He grabbed one of my bags before I could protest. "You packed light," he joked. "I assumed we would eventually find civilization again." He laughed, and for a few minutes everything felt exactly the way it always had. We loaded my camera gear beside a camping tent, 2 sleeping bags, a cooler full of snacks, hiking backpacks, and an absurd number of paper road maps. You know your phone has navigation, I said as I climbed into the passenger seat. Ryan tapped one of the folded maps resting on the dashboard. Phones run out of batteries. Paper never does. That sounded exactly like him. We merged onto Interstate 90 while the morning traffic slowly thinned behind us. The Chicago skyline grew smaller in the mirrors until it finally disappeared altogether. Neither of us said anything for several miles. Instead, Ryan reached over and connected an old playlist we had made during our senior year of college. The first song started playing, and within seconds we were both singing completely off-key, laughing harder than either of us had in months. Somewhere outside Madison, we stopped at a small roadside diner with cracked leather booths and unlimited coffee refills. The waitress smiled as she poured our mugs and asked if we were brothers. Ryan looked at me with a grin before answering. No, we have just known each other forever. There was something strangely comforting about that answer. We spent lunch arguing over which state had the best roadside diners, debating whether pancakes counted as acceptable lunch food, and laughing about college memories that somehow became funnier every year. Yet every so often I caught Ryan quietly looking out the window instead of joining the conversation, as though he was trying to memorize every passing truck, every family walking into the restaurant, every ordinary moment. Most people would never notice. Back on the highway, Wisconsin slowly gave way to Minnesota, and the landscape opened into endless fields beneath a sky so wide it almost looked unreal. Ryan rolled down the windows, letting cool air fill the cabin. This, he said with a contented smile, is exactly what I needed. Getting away from work? I asked. Getting away from everything. His answer was honest, but somehow incomplete. Late that afternoon, we stopped at a scenic overlook where the Mississippi River shimmered beneath the lowering sun. I instinctively reached for my camera while Ryan wandered several yards away, standing quietly against the wooden railing with his hands in his pockets. Instead of admiring the river, he simply closed his eyes and took a long, slow breath. I raised my camera toward him without thinking. The shutter clicked softly. He turned, noticed me smiling behind the lens, and laughed. You always catch me when I am not paying attention. Those are usually the best photographs, I replied. He walked over and looked at the image on the screen for a long moment. Promise me something, he said. Keep taking pictures, even when I tell you not to. I lowered the camera slightly. That is a very specific request. Just promise me. I searched his face for an explanation, but all I found was that same quiet smile hiding something I could not yet understand. All right, I said. I promise. He nodded once, climbed back into the SUV, and pointed us west again while the evening sun slowly painted the road ahead in shades of gold. And although I could not explain why, I suddenly had the unmistakable feeling that every mile from that moment forward was going to matter far more than either of us was willing to admit. The farther west we drove, the quieter the world became. Cell phone signals faded in and out until eventually neither of us bothered checking our screens anymore. There was something strangely comforting about that. For the first time in years, nobody expected an immediate reply. Nobody cared about deadlines or calendars. The road asked nothing from us except that we kept moving. By late afternoon, we crossed into South Dakota, where the endless plains slowly gave way to dramatic rock formations unlike anything I had ever seen before. Ryan insisted we take the scenic route through Badlands National Park, claiming that highways always skipped the best parts of America. As usual, he was right. We spent nearly 2 hours stopping every few miles because I could not resist photographing another breathtaking overlook. Each ridge seemed to glow a different shade of orange beneath the lowering sun, while shadows stretched across the valleys like waves frozen in time. Ryan never complained about the delays. Instead, he wandered quietly through every overlook, occasionally pointing out details I would have missed, like a lone hawk circling above the cliffs or tiny wildflowers somehow growing between the rocks. It reminded me why traveling with him had always felt effortless. He noticed the world differently than anyone else I had ever known. That evening we rented a small wooden cabin instead of setting up the tent because the forecast promised temperatures in the low 40s overnight. The place was simple, with one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a front porch overlooking miles of open prairie. After making sandwiches for dinner, we carried our plates outside and watched the sky slowly transform into a sea of stars. I had forgotten that the night could actually look like this. Back in Chicago, city lights swallowed most of the sky before darkness ever had a chance. Out here, every constellation seemed close enough to touch. Ryan leaned back in his chair and smiled without saying a word. Worth the drive? I asked. Every mile, he answered softly. We stayed there long after our food was gone, listening to crickets and distant wind moving through the grass. Eventually, Ryan disappeared inside for a moment before returning with a small instant camera I had not noticed before. Hold still, he said. Before I could ask why, the flash fired. He studied the photograph while it slowly developed, smiled to himself, then slipped it into a worn leather notebook instead of handing it to me. Since when do you keep the pictures? I asked. I thought we always split them. I wanted to save these together. For what? He hesitated just long enough for the question to become uncomfortable. Just something I am working on. He changed the subject almost immediately, asking whether I remembered the first camping trip we had taken during college. I laughed because neither of us had known how to pitch a tent correctly, and we had spent half the night sleeping inside his SUV after rain flooded everything else. Ryan laughed harder than I had heard him laugh in years. For a little while, every strange feeling from the past few days disappeared. Later that night, we shared the only bed because the old sofa looked like it might collapse under the weight of a backpack. It was never awkward between us. 8 years of friendship had erased that kind of self-consciousness long ago. The room was completely dark except for pale moonlight slipping through the curtains. Just before falling asleep, Ryan spoke so quietly that I almost thought I had imagined it. Do you ever wonder how one decision changes everything? I turned toward him. Sometimes, like getting lost during freshman orientation. I smiled into the darkness. That mistake worked out pretty well. He let out a quiet laugh. Yeah, it really did. Sometime during the night, I woke briefly and realized he had shifted closer in his sleep, one shoulder resting lightly against mine beneath the blanket. It was an ordinary accident between lifelong friends, nothing more than two exhausted travelers sharing a small bed after a long day on the road. Yet as I lay there listening to the wind outside the cabin, I could not ignore the impossible hope my heart insisted on carrying, even after all these years. The next morning we left the cabin before sunrise, carrying hot coffee into air cold enough to make every breath visible. Ryan stood quietly beside the SUV for a moment before climbing into the driver's seat, looking out across the empty prairie as if he wanted to remember every color painted across the horizon. Neither of us rushed to leave. Somehow the silence had become part of the trip, not awkward or uncomfortable, but filled with things we were not quite ready to say. We crossed into Wyoming by early afternoon, and the landscape slowly transformed from rolling grasslands into towering mountains and endless forests. Every hour seemed to reveal another place neither of us wanted to leave. Ryan kept choosing smaller scenic roads instead of faster highways, insisting that the best memories never happened on the quickest route. We stopped at a tiny roadside general store outside Yellowstone where shelves overflowed with handmade souvenirs, postcards, hiking maps, and local photography books. Ryan disappeared for several minutes while I wandered through the camera section. When I finally found him, he was standing near a postcard display, carefully writing something inside a small leather notebook before sliding another postcard between its pages. The moment he noticed me approaching, he quietly closed the notebook and smiled. You really are turning into a mystery, I teased. Maybe I finally decided to keep one secret from you. He laughed softly, but the smile disappeared almost as quickly as it had arrived. There was something different about him now. It was not fear exactly. It was more like someone trying very hard to enjoy every ordinary moment while quietly carrying a weight no one else could see. Yellowstone somehow managed to exceed every photograph I had ever seen. Steam drifted upward from colorful geothermal pools while sunlight filtered through tall pine trees, creating beams of light that looked almost unreal. Families filled the wooden boardwalks. Children pointed excitedly toward distant geysers, and every few minutes someone asked if I would take a family photograph with their phone. Ryan watched me doing it with an expression I could not quite understand. You always make strangers smile, he said as we continued walking. That is because they know they are getting their phone back, I joked. He laughed, shaking his head. No, it is because you make people feel seen. His words caught me completely off guard. Before I could respond, his phone began vibrating inside his jacket pocket. He glanced at the screen, and for the first time since we left Chicago, the warmth disappeared from his face. "I need 1 minute," he said quietly before walking several yards away. I pretended to study the scenery, but fragments of his conversation drifted toward me whenever the wind changed direction. "I understand." "No, not yet. Please." I promised I would call when we finished. His voice remained calm, yet every sentence seemed heavier than the one before it. When he returned, he slipped the phone back into his pocket and smiled as though nothing had happened. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Just work checking in," he answered almost instantly. The explanation sounded rehearsed. Ryan had ignored work emails for days without caring. Now suddenly they were calling him in the middle of Yellowstone. I nodded anyway, choosing not to push. That evening we checked into a small lodge surrounded by pine trees. While Ryan carried groceries inside for dinner, I opened the rear hatch of the SUV to grab my camera bag. As I lifted it, a large white envelope slid from beneath one of the backpacks onto the floor. I instinctively bent down to pick it up before the wind carried it away. Across the upper corner, I noticed the unmistakable logo of a major Chicago medical center. I stared at it for only a second before carefully placing it exactly where I had found it. When I walked into the lodge a moment later, Ryan looked up from the kitchen with the same familiar smile he had worn all week. But for the first time since this journey began, I realized I was no longer wondering whether he was hiding something from me. I was wondering how long he had been carrying that secret completely alone. The hospital envelope stayed in the back of my mind long after I walked away from it. I never mentioned it during dinner. I never asked another question that night. Instead, we cooked pasta together in the tiny lodge kitchen while Ryan argued that too much garlic did not exist, and I pretended to believe everything was still normal. We laughed over old stories from college, washed dishes side by side, and ended the evening sitting outside beneath another impossibly clear sky. From a distance, nothing about us had changed. Up close, everything had. The next morning we continued west, leaving Yellowstone behind as mountains slowly gave way to long stretches of open highway. Around lunchtime we crossed into Idaho, where quiet farming towns and endless fields replaced the dramatic scenery we had grown used to. Ryan seemed unusually cheerful that day. He insisted we stop at a roadside fruit stand because a handwritten sign claimed it sold the best homemade peach pie in the state. We shared one slice with 2 plastic forks while sitting on a weathered picnic table, laughing when juice dripped onto his flannel shirt. "Worth the stop?" I asked. "Absolutely," he said without hesitation. "The best trips are built from places nobody plans to remember." It was another one of those sentences that sounded ordinary until I thought about it later. Every few miles Ryan asked me to take another photograph, not of famous landmarks or scenic overlooks, but of little things most travelers ignored. An abandoned gas station with an old neon sign, a faded mailbox standing alone beside a dirt road, a lonely swing hanging from an enormous oak tree, a weathered wooden fence disappearing into golden fields. "Why these?" I finally asked. He looked through the windshield before answering. "Because ordinary things disappear too. People just notice them later." His words settled quietly between us. That afternoon we stopped beside a peaceful mountain lake where the water reflected snow-covered peaks so perfectly they looked like another world beneath the surface. While I wandered along the shoreline with my camera, Ryan stayed near the SUV. When I looked back, I saw him sitting on the rear bumper with the leather notebook open across his knees. He carefully slipped another instant photograph inside before writing several lines beneath it. This time he did not notice me watching. His expression was calm, almost grateful, yet there was sadness behind it that no smile could completely hide. I looked away before he saw me. Some moments deserved privacy, even when they made no sense. We checked into a small roadside motel outside Boise shortly before sunset. Ryan volunteered to pick up dinner from a nearby diner while I carried our bags inside. As I reached into the back of the SUV for my jacket, his backpack tipped sideways, spilling several items onto the seat. I immediately bent down to gather everything before it fell onto the ground. A prescription bottle rolled gently against my hand. I froze. The label was facing upward now, and although I did not read every detail, I recognized the same Chicago Medical Center printed across it that I had seen on the envelope. Beneath the bottle rested a folded appointment schedule marked with several upcoming dates. I carefully placed everything back exactly as I had found it before closing the backpack. My heart felt impossibly heavy by the time Ryan returned carrying 2 paper bags that smelled like burgers and fresh fries. During dinner, he talked excitedly about seeing the Bonneville Salt Flats the following day, asking whether sunrise or sunset would make better photographs. I answered every question, but my mind remained fixed on the backpack. Finally, I set my drink down and quietly said his name. Ryan. He looked up immediately. Yeah. I held his eyes for several long seconds before asking the only question that mattered anymore. Is there something you have been trying very hard to protect me from? His smile disappeared, replaced by a silence that felt longer than the thousands of miles we had already traveled together. After a deep breath, he lowered his eyes and spoke so softly I almost missed the words. Just give me one more ordinary day, Ethan. Tomorrow, I promise I will tell you everything. We left Boise before sunrise, and for the first hour neither of us spoke. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, framed by pale mountains slowly catching the first light of morning. Ryan drove with one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, while the other tapped quietly against the door in rhythm with a song neither of us was really listening to. I wanted to ask him 100 questions, but I had made him a promise the night before. One more ordinary day? I intended to keep it. Around mid-morning we crossed into Utah, where the landscape gradually transformed into vast open spaces unlike anywhere I had ever seen. The farther we drove, the fewer buildings remained, until it felt as though the entire world had been reduced to sky, mountains, and road. Ryan smiled, more than he had in days. He pointed out unusual rock formations, insisted we stop for coffee at a tiny gas station that looked as though it had not changed since the 1970s, and even convinced me to buy a postcard with the ugliest desert cactus ever printed. For a few precious hours, everything almost felt normal again. By late afternoon, we reached the Bonneville Salt Flats. I stepped out of the SUV and immediately understood why Ryan had wanted to come here. Endless white stretched in every direction until the horizon disappeared into the sky itself. There were no buildings, no distractions, only silence so complete that it almost felt sacred. We walked away from the parking area without saying much, our footsteps leaving faint marks across the bright surface. Ryan finally stopped several hundred feet from the road and looked out toward the horizon. The wind tugged gently at his shirt while the late afternoon sun painted everything in soft gold. Beautiful, is it not? He asked quietly. It does not even look real, I answered. He nodded, keeping his eyes on the distance. That is why I wanted to come. I waited. He took a slow breath before continuing. Do you remember what you asked me last night? I already knew the answer. I asked if you were protecting me from something. He nodded once. You were right. My chest tightened. Ryan reached into his backpack and carefully removed the same white envelope I had seen inside the SUV. This time he placed it directly into my hands instead of hiding it away. I looked down at it, but did not open it. Somehow I already knew that once I did, there would be no returning to the version of our lives that had existed before this moment. 6 months ago, Ryan said softly, I was diagnosed with a serious illness. The words seemed to disappear into the enormous silence surrounding us. The doctors believed treatment would give me a lot more time. For a while, it looked like they were right. He paused before offering a small, tired smile. A few weeks before I called you, they told me the treatment was no longer working the way they hoped. I felt my throat tighten so completely that speaking became impossible. Ryan looked down at the brilliant white ground beneath his feet. I did not ask you to come because I wanted sympathy. I asked because I realized I had spent years postponing everything that truly mattered. I kept believing there would always be another vacation, another conversation, another chance. His voice became quieter than the wind itself. Then I realized the only trip I truly wanted was the one I had never taken with the person who had been beside me through every important chapter of my life. I finally looked up from the unopened envelope and met his eyes. They were filled not with fear, but with relief, as though carrying the truth alone had been far heavier than speaking it aloud. Standing together beneath that endless western sky, I understood that the road ahead had changed forever, and that no photograph I would ever take could fully capture the moment my best friend finally trusted me enough to let me share the weight he had been carrying alone. For a long time, neither of us moved. The wind swept quietly across the endless white salt, carrying away every sound except our breathing. I stared at the unopened envelope in my hands, knowing that whatever was written inside no longer mattered as much as the fact that Ryan had finally trusted me enough to stop carrying it alone. I slipped the envelope back toward him without opening it. "I do not need to read it," I said quietly. "I believe you." Ryan looked surprised. "You are not curious?" I shook my head. "I am, but I would rather hear it from my best friend than from a piece of paper." A faint smile crossed his face, the first genuine smile I had seen since arriving at the Salt Flats. We remained there until the sun began drifting lower, painting the brilliant white ground with soft shades of gold and orange. On the drive toward our small motel in northern Utah, neither of us pretended everything was normal anymore. Instead, we talked honestly for the first time since leaving Chicago. Ryan told me about endless doctor appointments, optimistic conversations that slowly became uncertain, and the moment he realized life could no longer be measured by plans 5 years away. The strange thing, he admitted while watching the road, is that I was never afraid of dying as much as I was afraid of leaving things unsaid. I looked out the passenger window for several seconds before answering. "You have never had to earn your place in my life, Ryan. You have always been there." He smiled without looking away from the highway. "That is exactly why I wanted this trip." We reached the motel just after sunset. After a simple dinner, Ryan carried 2 folding chairs outside, and we sat beneath an enormous sky filled with stars brighter than any I had ever seen back home. After several quiet minutes, he reached into his backpack and placed the worn leather notebook in my lap. "It is time," he said softly. I looked at him. "Are you sure?" He nodded once. "Start wherever you want." I slowly opened the notebook. The first pages were filled with instant photographs from our journey. Me standing beside the Mississippi River. Me laughing outside the roadside diner. Me adjusting my camera in Badlands. Me watching geysers in Yellowstone. Under every picture, Ryan had written a few sentences in careful handwriting. Some were funny memories. Others described moments I had not even realized he had noticed. I turned another page and found the postcards. None of them had stamps. None of them had addresses. Every single one began with the same words. "Dear Ethan." My hands froze. Ryan looked toward the stars instead of at me. I wrote one every time I realized there was something I had never told you. I read only the first few lines before quietly closing the notebook again. "I cannot keep reading," I whispered. "Not yet." He nodded as though he had expected that answer. "That is okay." We sat together in comfortable silence until I finally asked the question that had been living inside me for years without ever finding the courage to leave. "Ryan, what do you regret the most?" He thought for a long time before answering. "Not working too much. Not waiting too long to travel. Not chasing promotions that never really mattered." He turned toward me, and his eyes reflected the starlight with quiet honesty. "I regret believing there would always be another tomorrow to tell the people I loved exactly how much they meant to me." My heart felt as though it had stopped. He was not looking at the stars anymore. He was looking directly at me, and for the first time since we had met 8 years earlier, there was nothing left hidden behind his smile. The next morning, we crossed the California state line just after sunrise, and neither of us said a word when the welcome sign appeared beside the highway. Ryan simply smiled to himself before reaching over to turn the music down until only the sound of the tires remained. Somehow silence had become our most honest language. We stopped more often that day than we had anywhere else on the trip. Sometimes it was because I spotted a beautiful overlook. Sometimes it was because Ryan wanted to stand still for a few minutes and watch the world without feeling rushed. We wandered through small coastal towns, shared fish tacos from a tiny family-owned restaurant overlooking the water, and laughed over the fact that we had somehow managed to survive thousands of miles together without arguing about directions even once. "That might be the most unbelievable part of this whole trip," I joked. Ryan laughed. "I had paper maps. We never stood a chance of getting lost." By late afternoon, we finally reached the Pacific Ocean. The sky stretched endlessly above the water, painted with soft shades of blue and gold, while gentle waves rolled steadily onto the shore. Ryan parked the SUV overlooking the beach and turned off the engine. Neither of us hurried to get out. We simply sat there looking at the horizon as though it had been waiting for us all along. "We actually made it," I said quietly. "Yeah," Ryan answered with a peaceful smile. "We did." We carried our shoes down to the sand and walked slowly along the edge of the water, letting the cold Pacific wash around our feet. Families played farther down the beach, children chased seagulls across the shoreline, and surfers waited patiently beyond the breaking waves. Ordinary life continued around us, completely unaware that my entire world had quietly changed over the past 3 weeks. Ryan stopped walking first. He looked out across the ocean before speaking. "There is one more thing I need to tell you." My heart immediately began racing, but I stayed silent. He folded his hands into the pockets of his jacket and smiled with quiet uncertainty. For years I kept telling myself that everything I felt could be explained away. I called it friendship because that answer was easier. I convinced myself that admiring you, missing you whenever we were apart, wanting every important memory to include you, all of that was normal. He laughed softly at himself. Maybe it was. Maybe it was not. I honestly do not know anymore. He turned toward me, and I saw a vulnerability I had never witnessed before. What I do know is that when I started thinking about the people who mattered most, every road somehow led back to you. I could not look away. Ryan took a slow breath before continuing. I spent years saying I was straight because that was the only version of myself I thought made sense. Then this journey forced me to stop pretending I understood everything about my own heart. His voice became almost a whisper. If my life has ever had one exception, one person who changed every certainty I thought I had, it has always been you. Tears blurred my vision before I even realized they had formed. I laughed quietly, shaking my head in disbelief. "Ryan," I said, "I have loved you since college." He closed his eyes for a brief moment, and when he opened them again, his smile carried more relief than surprise. "I think part of me always knew," he admitted. We stood together facing the ocean without needing to say anything else. There were no dramatic promises, no perfect speeches, only the steady rhythm of the waves and two lifelong friends who had finally found the courage to stop hiding from the truth. As the sun slowly drifted toward the horizon, I realized that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin only after two people stop trying to become who they think they are supposed to be and finally allow themselves to become exactly who they have always been. The following morning, we returned to the beach before sunrise, carrying 2 cups of coffee as the sky slowly shifted from deep blue to soft shades of gold. The shoreline was almost empty except for a few early joggers and distant surfers waiting patiently beyond the waves. Ryan stood quietly with his hands wrapped around the warm paper cup, watching the horizon brighten 1 minute at a time. "I used to think life was measured by years," he said without taking his eyes off the ocean. "Now I think it is measured by mornings like this." I smiled sadly. "Then this one counts for a lot." He laughed softly. "It definitely does." We spent the next several hours doing almost nothing at all, and somehow those ordinary moments became the ones I remember most clearly. We walked through a small farmer's market, shared fresh pastries from a neighborhood bakery, watched children build sandcastles near the pier, and took far too many photographs of waves that somehow all looked different. Ryan finally stopped asking me to put the camera away. Instead, every time I lifted it toward him, he simply smiled and let me capture the moment. "I finally understand why you never stopped taking pictures," he admitted. "You were trying to keep time from moving." I lowered the camera and looked at him. "It never works." "No," he agreed. "But at least it reminds us that we were here." Before leaving the beach, Ryan reached into his backpack one last time and placed the leather notebook in my hands again. "This time I want you to keep it," he said. "Do not wait until later to read it." I nodded quietly because I finally understood what he meant. Some gifts were never meant to stay hidden. The drive back toward the city felt different from every mile that had come before it. The destination no longer mattered. We rolled down the windows, played the same old college playlist one last time, and laughed whenever we forgot the lyrics exactly the way we always had. Nothing about the road had changed, yet everything inside me had. Before we reached the airport where I would catch my flight home, Ryan parked the SUV overlooking one final stretch of coastline. We stood there for several quiet minutes before he pulled me into a simple embrace that carried 8 years of friendship, 3 unforgettable weeks, and every word we had waited too long to say. "Thank you for coming," he whispered. "There was never anywhere else I would have been," I answered. We smiled at each other, not because the future suddenly seemed easy, but because neither of us was carrying the truth alone anymore. 1 year later, I found myself driving that same green SUV along another quiet highway with my camera resting on the passenger seat and Ryan's leather notebook safely tucked inside the glove compartment. The treatment had given him more time than either of us had expected, and although life still brought uncertainty, we had learned to stop measuring happiness by guarantees. Instead, we measured it by conversations that mattered, roads explored together, ordinary breakfasts that somehow became unforgettable, and sunsets we no longer postponed for another day. I eventually published a photography collection inspired by our journey across America. On the final page, I placed one photograph of Ryan standing beside the Pacific Ocean with the morning light reflecting across the water behind him. Beneath that photograph, I printed a single sentence from the notebook that had become the truest lesson of my life. The people who change you forever are rarely the ones who promise forever. They are the ones who teach you how to cherish today. Every time I read those words, I remember the road, the laughter, the silence, the courage it took for two best friends to tell the truth, and I realized that the greatest journey we ever completed was never the drive across America. It was the distance between fear and honesty, and once we crossed it together, neither of us was ever truly lost again.